Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect, breathe the fresh air, and bond with old friends in the heart of the forest, a secluded camping spot, far from the chaos of the city, nestled among tall, ancient trees. But the forest had a way of making you feel small. The towering pines cast long shadows over the camp, and the constant rustling of leaves seemed to whisper secrets that no one should ever hear. The group of five, Laura, Mark, Sophie, Ryan, and Jack, set up their tents near a small clearing by the edge of the woods. The fire crackled in the center, casting flickering light that danced on the faces of the group, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air. But as the evening wore on and the stars began to emerge, a strange sense of unease settled in. It wasn't the wind, though it howled through the trees, or the way the shadows shifted under the light of the fire. It wasn't even the fact that they were miles away from civilization, with no signal on their phones, no one around for miles. It was something else. As the night deepened and the fire flickered down to embers, they could hear a faint light tapping sound in the distance, like footsteps walking through the woods far beyond the camp. At first, they dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, scrounging around in the dark. But when the footsteps persisted, steady, rhythmic, as if someone was walking toward them, the sense of unease turned to something darker, something more menacing. "What's that?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been staring into the woods, her eyes narrowing as if trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving just beyond the trees. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Probably nothing. Just animal. Don't freak out." But the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. Footsteps, a steady, deliberate step, followed by another and another. Laura, sitting at the edge of the camp, stood up abruptly. "It's not an animal. I think someone's out there." Mark laughed nervously, but the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on. We're deep in the woods. No one's around." But just as he spoke, the group heard something else. A faint flickering light in the distance at first. It seemed like a trick of the firelight, just shadows dancing through the trees. But then it moved. Slowly at first, but unmistakably. A lantern, glowing softly in the distance, its light swaying in the distance. Its light swaying with each step. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. It wasn't the glow of a campfire or the beam of a flashlight. It was too dim, too steady, as if it were coming from someone or something deep in the woods or whatever was carrying it, moving closer, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps accompanied it. Sophie stood up slowly, her eyes wide. "We should go back to the car. Now!" Mark shook his head. "You're all overreacting. It's just someone else out here camping." There's no reason to panic. But even as he said it, the group couldn't ignore the feeling that was growing in the pit of their stomachs. The air seemed thicker now, the shadows deeper, and the lantern light, it didn't seem to be flickering. It didn't seem to be flickering in the way it should. It almost looked unnatural. Laura turned to Ryan, her face pale. "I'm serious. I don't like this. I think we should leave." Ryan, who had been staring into the distance, nodded slowly, his face hardening. "Yeah, I agree. There's something wrong." Without another word, the group gathered their belongings hastily. The fire was forgotten as they packed up their things, but the lantern light continued to draw closer. The footsteps were still there, slow, deliberate, like something waiting for them to make a move. They began to walk briskly through the woods, the sound of their own feet crunching through the leaves adding to the eerie tension. The lantern light, however, never wavered. It was as if it had been tracking them from the moment it appeared. "Guys, do you see it?" Jack asked, his voice quivering with a mix of fear and confusion. They all turned to look, and for the first time, they saw the lantern, moving closer, almost as if it were floating through the trees. It wasn't being carried by anyone, it just hung there in the darkness, glowing softly, like a ghostly presence. Sophie stopped in her tracks. "It's not real," she whispered. "This can't be real." But the lantern was real. It was there, hanging in the trees, swaying as if caught in the trees, swaying as if caught in the wind, but no breeze was stirring the air. Laura pulled at Sophie's arm. "Come on, we have to keep moving." They kept walking, but the glow of the lantern seemed to match their pace, getting closer with each step they took. The further they walked, the more intense the light became, until it was almost blinding, and yet they couldn't get away from Fran. They couldn't escape its pull. "What the hell is going on?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky, fear now creeping into his tone. "Why won't it stop?" Then, without warning, the lantern stopped moving. It hovered in the air just ahead of them, suspended like a beacon. Its glow intensified, flooding the entire clearing with an unnatural light, and from the shadows, something began to emerge. A figure, tall, pale. Its form seemed to shimmer in the lantern light, like it was made of the very darkness that surrounded them. Its features were hidden, obscured by a shadowy veil, but the feeling it gave off was undeniable. Malevolent, predatory, ancient. The figure took a step forward, its movements fluid, almost graceful, as it moved closer to them. And then it spoke. Its voice was not loud, but it was everywhere, echoing in their minds, sending a chill down their spines. "You should not have come here," the words echoed in their minds, and the very air around them seemed to grow colder, heavier. The figure, its shadowy form, now clearer in the lantern's unearthly glow, stared at them with what could only be described as a hunger. It didn't have eyes in the traditional sense, but the darkness where its eyes should have been seemed to pierce into their souls, searching, probing, judging. Jason, who had been standing at the back of the group, felt a chill crawl up his spine. He could hear his heartbeat, loud and frantic, echoing in his ears. The voice that spoke wasn't human. It wasn't even close to anything he had ever heard. It was deep, resonating in places in his mind. That shouldn't have been reached, and it felt like something ancient, something that existed long before the world they knew. "Who are you?" "Are you?" Laura asked, her voice shaking. She tried to sound brave, but the fear was obvious. None of them had ever felt anything like this before. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it slowly tilted its head, as if studying them. The cold wind around them whipped through the trees, but the figure remained unmoving, its form perfectly still, as if it were part of the very forest itself. It took a step closer, and Jason's heart nearly stopped. He could feel the air grow thicker around him, like the very space between them was being suffocated by the figure's presence. It was an ancient energy, cold and oppressive, that made everything feel wrong. "You've stumbled into something far older than your fox trusting. Or quite so ignorant." "Understanding," the figure finally said, its voice ringing through the woods like a warning bell. "This place, it is not meant for you." The lantern flickered in the figure's hand, though it did not hold it physically, and it hovered, casting a pale, dim, ghostly light across the woods. As the light shifted, Jason swore he saw something moving in the shadows beyond the figure. Dozens of dark shapes, flitting just out of reach, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. We were here long before you, the voice continued, growing colder. Long before your kind ever thought to trespass here. Ryan was the first to move. He grabbed Sophie's arm and began backing away. But his movements were stiff, unnatural, like his limbs were heavy with the weight of unseen forces. We need to leave now, he whispered, almost to himself, but loud enough for the group to hear. Jason felt the pull of fear tighten around his chest. He had to listen to his instincts, to the cold dread that told him this place, this forest, wasn't just a part of the world anymore. It was something else, something beyond their understanding. And whatever this figure was, it didn't want them here. Leave now, the figure intoned, its voice now tinged with a low growl. But know this, if you leave, you will never return to the world you once knew. You will walk away from this, but your souls will never be free. Jason's breath caught in his throat, threatened them. It was as if their very existence here had shattered something that couldn't be undone. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure began to retreat, slowly, its form blending into the shadows once more. The lantern's light grew dimmer, its glow fading until it was almost invisible. For a moment, everything was quiet. The wind rustled the trees, and the sounds of the night returned, as if the figure had never existed. Jason stood frozen, as if the figure had never existed, heart still racing, his mind unable to process what had just happened. We need to go, Mark said, his voice tight, his eyes darting toward the now empty space where the figure had stood. Without another word, the group turned and began to move quickly through the woods, their footsteps heavy against the dry ground. The air felt thick, like something was still pressing in on them, watching them from the darkness. The path back to camp seemed to stretch endlessly. It wasn't far, but it felt like the woods were trying to keep them trapped, each step taking them deeper into the abyss. The trees were closer now, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, reaching out as if to grab them. The lantern light had disappeared entirely. There was nothing but the darkness, and the oppressive feeling that they weren't truly alone in these woods. Finally, after what felt like hours, they stumbled back into the clearing where they had set up camp. The tents were still up camp, there, untouched. But everything felt different. The fire pit, which they had left smoldering, was now completely cold. The air was still, quiet, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, that the presence, the figure, wasn't done with them. He glanced nervously around the clearing, his eyes scanning the edges of the trees. Sophie, standing next to him, finally spoke. What was that? What did we just see? Jason shook his head, unable to find the words. He had no explanation. He had never felt anything like that in his life, and the terror of it still clung to him, making his skin crawl. Mark sat down heavily on a nearby log, running his hands through his hair. We shouldn't be here. I knew something was off when we first arrived. But this and something else. They all knew what he meant. It wasn't just the woods that were cursed. It was something older, deeper, lurking, older, deeper, lurking beneath the surface, and they had unknowingly disturbed it. Laura pulled out her phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but the screen flickered and went blank. No signal, she muttered, tapping the screen in frustration. Jason looked up. Tapping the screen in frustration! Toward the dark woods, the trees seemed to move in the wind. But there was something else, something in the distance, beyond the trees, waiting, watching. We need to leave, he said, his voice firm, but his hands trembling. They all nodded, but no one moved. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone, to tell them what to do next. And then, in the distance, Jason saw it again. The faint glow of the lantern, Jason's heart skipped a beat as the glow of the lantern appeared again, faint but undeniable, flickering through the trees. It wasn't the same light they had seen earlier. It was closer now, and the air around it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The faint glow pulsed, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Jason felt his pulse quicken. "We need to go now," Jason said, his voice urgent, but his words didn't seem to make it through to the group. Everyone stood frozen, their eyes glued to the glowing lantern in the distance, as if something was holding them in place, unwilling to let them leave. Ryan finally broke the silence, his voice shaky. "This isn't real. This can't be real. There's no way." Mark, usually the calm one of the group, stood with one of the group, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed. "I thought I saw something out there earlier, something unnatural. And now this." Jason's eyes never left the lantern. He could feel its pull, the same dark, magnetic force that had led them into the Thirst Woods in the first place. He couldn't explain it, but he knew they had to get out of here before whatever was out there came for them. As the lantern continued to glow softly in the distance, it seemed to sway, its light flickering in rhythm with the sound of the wind moving through the trees. But the wind wasn't natural. It was too still, too controlled, as if something was making the forest hold its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. Without another word, Jason turned toward the edge of the clearing, his steps quick and deliberate. "We're leaving," he said, voice firm. "Now." The group didn't hesitate this time. They followed him, their footsteps quick as they moved away from the fire and toward the edge of the woods. Every step felt heavy, weighed down by an oppressive force that seemed to follow them, a shadow just beyond their reach. The lantern continued to glow in the distance, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them, pulling them back toward the darkness. As they moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere seemed to change. The trees pressed in around them, their branches twisting and creaking, blocking out more of the moonlight with each step they took. The air grew colder, the familiar sounds of the forest replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. The only noise was the sound of their hurried footsteps on the soft forest floor. Sophie, who had been walking beside Jason, suddenly stopped, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jason turned to look at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. But then he heard it too, the faintest whisper, like the rustling of leaves. But there was no wind. The trees were completely still. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and suddenly Jason realized it wasn't just wind. It was a voice. "Come back," it said, soft but insistent. Jason's blood ran cold. He turned, trying to locate the source of the voice, but saw nothing. The trees were still. The moonlight filtering weakly through the branches. Yet the voice persisted. "You can't escape. You belong here." Mark looked around nervously. "What the hell? Is someone messing with us?" Jason didn't answer. He could feel it, a presence in the air that wasn't human. The voice wasn't just a sound. It was an invitation, a lure. Something was out there, in the dark, watching them, and it wanted them to return. Another voice, watching them, and it wanted them to return, this time louder, echoing in his mind. "You have to stay. You're part of this now." Jason snapped his head around. The lantern's glow flickered in the distance, its light now brighter, as though drawing them closer. It was no longer just a light. It was something more, something alive. "Go!" Jason shouted, breaking the trance. "Run!" They bolted, running as fast as they could through the thickening trees, the ground beneath their feet slippery with wet leaves. But as they ran, it felt as if the forest itself was changing. the trees closing in tighter, the shadows growing in tighter, the shadows growing darker, thicker. The path they had taken earlier seemed to vanish, and the trees twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The world around them was warping, shifting. The whispering voice followed them, growing louder, clearer. "You can't escape. You are ours." Jason's chest tightened. The fear, the dread, it was overwhelming. But there was one thought that kept racing through his mind. They had to make it out. They had to survive. But with every step, the trees seemed to press in more. The sounds growing louder, the air thicker. The lantern's glow was getting brighter, pulling them in like a lighthouse guiding them toward doom. Suddenly, they burst out into a clearing. Jason stopped dead in his tracks. Before them stood the figure, the same one they had seen earlier. But now, it wasn't just a shadow. It had form, tall, almost human, but distorted. Its limbs were too long. Its face a dark void with glowing eyes that shone like embers in the night, and in its hands, the lantern. It moved closer, its steps slow, deliberate, as if savoring every moment of their terror. "I told you," the voice echoed. "You cannot escape." Jason felt his knees weaken as the figure stepped forward. The air stepped forward, the air around them growing colder with each passing second. The trees seemed to lean in closer, the shadows dancing with malevolent intent. The figure raised the lantern, the light growing brighter, blinding in its intensity. Jason reached out, feeling the warmth of the light, but it was not comfort. It was suffocating. The voice, now loud and all-encompassing, filled his head. "You are mine." And then the world went black. The darkness swallowed them whole. Jason's mind raced. His mind raced. His mind raced. His body frozen in place, unable to move. The light from the lantern, which had once seemed like a guide, now felt like a cage, closing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in the overwhelming silence that followed. Air was thick and heavy, suffocating, like they were trapped in some invisible force that pressed down from all sides. "You are mine," the voice echoed again, but it didn't just fill his ears. It reverberated deep inside his bones, shaking him from the inside out. It was all-encompassing, and Jason could feel it, an icy weight pressing against his chest, pushing him further into the darkness. He tried to move, tried to call out to the others, but his limbs were heavy. His voice were heavy. His voice lost in the thickening air. The shadows around him seemed to stretch further, to grow more solid, as if they were alive, pulling at him. But then, a crack in the silence. Sophie's voice, weak, trembling. "Jason!" Jason's head snapped in her direction, but the shadows were too thick. He couldn't see her, couldn't see any of them. His heart raced even faster, panic surging through him as he realized they had been separated in the darkness. He shouted, his voice hoarse. The darkness swallowed his words, leaving him with only the echo of his own breath. And then, the voice came again, louder, as if mocking him. "You are not the first. You will not be the last." Around, desperate, his mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. He could feel something, someone, moving in the darkness. The figure with the lantern was still there. Mist, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were all around him, closing in. Jason could hear the soft, almost imperceptible footsteps of others moving toward him. And with them, the coldness grew deeper, the air thicker. "You are thicker. You are thicker, part of this place now," the voice whispered, and Jason's stomach churned as he realized what it meant. "You will join us, just like all the others." He felt it then, the pull, a magnetic force, drawing him closer to the figure with the thigh. Lantern. He tried to resist, tried to step back, but his body moved of its own accord. his feet dragging him forward. "No!" he shouted, trying to break free from whatever was controlling him. But his limbs were no longer his own, moving slowly, as if they were being guided by some unseen hand. The shadows enveloped him, the coldness biting into his skin. Couldn't see the others anymore, only the figure and the lantern that now burned bright enough to burn his retinas. The air crackled with an eerie energy, the very space around him pulsing as if alive. And then the lantern's light flickered, and then the lantern's light flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. "You will stay here with us, forever." Jason's heart sank. His breath caught in his throat as the darkness shifted around him, closing in, suffocating him. The figure in front of him raised the lantern, and suddenly Jason felt it like a wave crashing into him. His vision blurred, and his body went limp. For a split second, everything went silent. The world around him was still, and Jason could feel himself being pulled somewhere, pulled into a different space. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't escape it. Whatever this was, it was happening. And then, without warning, Jason collapsed to his knees, his body screaming as the pressure around him increased. The shadows around him seemed to fold in, closing in tighter, suffocating him. "You can never leave," the voice said, now a chilling whisper in his mind. "This place is your home now." Jason tried to move, tried to stand, but he couldn't. His body felt heavy, his mind spinning with confusion and terror. He could hear the others, their voices faint, distant. They were there, somewhere, but they were not in the same place. They were separated, lost in the void that had swallowed them all. "You will join us," the voice repeated, almost as if it were an inevitability. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to push himself to his feet, his hands trembling and weak, pressed against the cold earth. The shadows, pressed against the cold earth, were suffocating, but the darkness wasn't just in the trees. It was inside of him too, creeping into his thoughts, making him question whether this nightmare would ever end. But then, just as suddenly as the force had taken hold of him, pressure lifted. Jason gasped for air, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. He stood up, looking around in the fog. The figure was gone. The lantern's light had faded, and the eerie glow was replaced by the cold. Empty silence of the forest for a moment. Jason thought he had dreamed it all, but the air felt thick, and the shadows still lingered, watching him from the corners of his vision. He knew he hadn't imagined it. The darkness was real, and it was still with him. And in the distance, the faintest glow of a lantern flickered again, far off in the woods. Jason's heart raced in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, to escape before the darkness found him again. But he escaped before the darkness found him again. But he couldn't. He was trapped here, in this cursed forest, with something far worse than just trees and shadows. Something that seemed to feed off fear, off the desperation in his heart. Something ancient, powerful, and relentless. The faint light of the lantern flickered again in the distance, but this time it wasn't moving. It was stationary, like a beacon in the woods, its glow pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Jason felt himself drawn to it, his feet moving before his mind could process the warning bells that were going off in his head. He tried to resist, but it was no use. His legs moved on their own, as if the very air around him was pushing him forward. His mind raced, screaming at him to stop, to turn back. But his body, tired and weak, could only move closer to that haunting light. The forest seemed to close in around him as he walked, the trees growing denser, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The ground beneath him was uneven, the dirt soft and damp, like the earth itself was alive, shifting and changing as he took each step. The whispers returned, but now they were louder, more insistent. They were no longer coming from the shadows alone. They seemed to emanate from everywhere, swirling around him, inside his mind. "You cannot escape," they hissed. "You will never leave?" Jason's breath quickened. He could feel his chest tightening. His throat constricting as though the very air itself was closing in around him. The lantern's glow grew brighter as he moved closer, but it wasn't the comforting light of something benign. It was cold, hollow, like a beacon for something far more sinister. As he drew closer to the lantern, he saw a figure standing just beneath the light, its face obscured by the darkness that surrounded it. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge his presence, but Jason could feel its gaze. He could feel its presence deep in his bones, crawling under his skin. A low growl rumbled from somewhere behind him. Jason turned sharply, his eyes wide with fear. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't the growl of an animal. It was something more, something that sent chills racing down his spine. He tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't obey. They were rooted to the ground, as though the forest itself was holding him in place, not allowing him to leave. The figure in front of the lantern stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its form shifting in and out of focus. Jason couldn't make out its features, but he could feel the darkness surrounding it, feeding off him, pulling him into its grasp. Suddenly, the lantern, pulling him into its grasp, flickered violently, its light flickering and dying before it erupted into a blinding flash. Jason stumbled backward, his hands shielding his eyes from the searing light. But even as he shielded his face, he could feel the presence of the figure closing in on him, its very essence creeping into his mind, taking hold of his thoughts. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed in his head, louder than ever before. Jason shook his head, trying to block out the voice, trying to break free from the grip that it had on him. He had to fight. He couldn't let it take him again. He wouldn't let it win. But the light from the lantern continued to grow, burning brighter until it filled the entire clearing. The shadows twisted and writhed, taking on forms that seemed to shift and change, coalescing into something dark and grotesque. The figure in the light was no longer a shadow, no longer a distant presence. It was right in front of him, its twisted form rising from the fiashan. His soul ground like a nightmare-made flesh. Jason opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was trapped inside him, silenced by the force that held him in place. The figure's glowing eyes locked onto his, and Jason felt his entire eyes locked onto his body go cold. The world around him seemed to crumble. The trees, the ground, the very air itself. Everything seemed to melt away, replaced by a void of darkness. The figure's mouth opened, and Jason could hear it. Deep, ancient, and chilling. Deep, ancient, and chilling. "You are mine?" It was then that Jason realized what he had been running from all along. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the woods. It was the darkness itself. An ancient force that had been there long before he ever set foot in this cursed place. And now, it was too late. There was nowhere to run. The lantern light flared one last time, blinding Jason. Before everything went dark, Jason's senses were overwhelmed by the cold. A deep, biting cold that seemed to seep into every fiber of his being. The light had faded, leaving nothing but a void, an endless abyss that stretched around him. He tried to move, but his body felt like it was bound in invisible chains. Every movement felt heavy, as though something was keeping him anchored in place, not allowing him to escape. His mind screamed, his thoughts frantic. This is it. This is the end, he thought. The darkness, the figure, the haunting presence. It had all been leading to this moment. And Al been leading to this moment. Now, it felt as if time itself had stopped. But then, something shifted. There was a faint light, a dull, almost imperceptible glow. It flickered, hesitant, like a candle fighting against the wind. Jason's eyes snapped open, and he realized snapped open. He was no longer standing in the clearing. He was somewhere else. It was cold here, but not in the way it had been. The air wasn't suffocating, and the oppressive weight had lifted. He could move again, but it didn't feel right. The world around him was distorted, warped. The trees, if that's what they were twisted, their branches gnarled and bent in unnatural angles. The ground beneath his feet was soft, shifting like it wasn't entirely solid. Jason took a step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the earth as he moved. His heart was still pounding, but the terror that had gripped him moments before was slowly receding, replaced by confusion. Where was he? What had happened to the figure with the lantern? The forest? Then a voice. Soft, gentle, familiar. Jason? He spun around, his heart skipping a beat. And there she was. Sarah, coldness in the way she looked at him. Sarah, Jason whispered, stepping toward her, his voice hoarse. What's going on? Where are we? She didn't answer at first. She just stood there, watching him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, and Jason's stomach churned. It didn't feel like the Sarah he had known. There was a coldness, an emptiness in her, eyes that sent a shiver down his spine. Sarah, please, he said, his voice more urgent. What's happening? What's going on? She finally spoke, but her voice was not the voice he remembered. It was distant, almost robotic. You were never meant to leave. Jason froze. The words hit him like a physical blow. What? His voice cracked as he took another step forward, trying to reach her. What do you mean? I got out. I was getting out of that place. The house, the forest. Her gaze didn't waver. You are part of this now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The darkness will never let you go. It has marked you. Jason felt a sharp pang in his chest. No, I escaped it. I fought it off, he argued, shaking his head, stepping back. You have to believe me. I'm not part of this. Sarah's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. You're already too far gone, Jason. The ground beneath him began to shift. The light in the distance flickered again, and the shadows that had once been distant now seemed to creep closer, as if they were closing in on him. He turned around, but the forest was no longer the twisted, gnarled trees. Now, it was a vast expanse of darkness, stretching endlessly in every direction. Jason felt the coldness return, sharp and endlessly in every direction. Overwhelming, the voices began again, whispers at first, distant, but then growing louder, more insistent. You belong to us. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and he stumbled, feeling himself being drawn toward the center of the actually, of the darkness. He reached out to Sarah, but her form flickered, as though she wasn't really there at all. Sarah, Jason cried out, his voice full of desperation. No, please! But she was gone, disappeared into the darkness, leaving him alone. The ground beneath him began to crack, and Jason fell to his knees. The shadows reached out for him, the whispers rising in volume. They were no longer whispers. They were a chorus all around him, pressing against him, suffocating him. He could feel it now, the truth. The darkness wasn't something that could be escaped. It was a part of him, embedded deep within his soul. It had always been a part of him, and always been a part of him. Now, it was pulling him in. Jason's heart raced as the shadows closed in around him, their cold fingers wrapping around his limbs. The whispers were deafening now, all-encompassing, their words drowning out everything else. You will never drowning out everything else. Escape! Jason tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, the darkness too consuming. It swallowed him whole, pulling him deeper into the void, where there would be no escape. And as the last vestiges of light flickered and died, Jason knew that the darkness had claimed him forever. The silence that followed the crushing darkness felt like an eternity. Jason couldn't tell if he was still alive, or if he had passed into some other realm, trapped forever in this void. The weight of the shadows pressing in on him made his limbs feel numb, his chest tight with an invisible force that kept him from breathing properly. His mind was clouded, confused, unable to fully grasp what was happening. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His entire body felt paralyzed, suspended in a place that was neither here nor there. His eyes were open, but there was nothing to see. No light, no shape, just an endless sea of black. But then, something began to shift. A faint sound reached him, soft at first, but then growing louder, sharper. A voice. A familiar voice. Jason? 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 Can you hear me? It was Sarah's voice. The voice cut through the darkness like a blade, pulling Jason out of his trance. His head jerked forward as if snapping out of a nightmare, and he could feel his body moving again, though every motion was sluggish and heavy. His mind screamed for clarity, but the oppressive weight of the void made it impossible to focus. Sarah, he croaked, his voice barely a whisper in the emptiness. Where are you? Where are we? I'm here, she replied, her voice now closer, but still distorted, as if it was traveling through thick fog. I'm trying to reach you, Jason. You have to listen to me. You have to fight. Fight? Fight what? Jason felt his chest tighten with fear. The darkness pressing harder against him. He could feel it now. The suffocating force that had been holding him in place was beginning to recede, just slightly. The pressure lifted, but only a little. Everything you've seen, everything you've felt, it's not real, Sarah said urgently. This place, this prison, it's a trap. You have to wake up. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Wake up? He had been awake, hadn't he? He remembered running, escaping. The lantern, the shadows, the forest, the figure. He had seen it all. He couldn't have been asleep, could he? Sarah, I don't understand. Jason's voice trembled with the weight of his confusion, but he felt something stirring within him, a spark of hope, weak, but growing. Listen to me, Jason, she said, her voice now sharp, desperate. You're not in the forest anymore. You've been trapped by something ancient, something that's been feeding on your fear, your doubt. This is a manifestation, a projection of everything that scares you. Jason's mind spun. A projection? He couldn't think straight. He tried to move, to stand, but his body felt like it was still bound in place. Sarah, He wanted to ask her what to do, how to escape, but the words caught in his throat. A deep, guttural growl suddenly filled the air, vibrating through the darkness, shaking him to his core. It was the same growl he had heard in the forest, the same one that had haunted him. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, slowly at first, then growing larger until they were all he could see. The eyes were unblinking, cold, malevolent, and they locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The growl came again, louder now, more ferocious, as the figure of the creature began, louder now, more ferocious, as the figure of the creature began to materialize from the shadows. "Jason, you have to fight back," Sarah's voice cried out in desperation. But the creature's growl drowned her out. It was too loud, too powerful, and it pressed down on Jason, filling his mind with terror. He could feel the fear trying to take hold of him, trying to pull him back into the darkness. The eyes grew closer, their glow burning through him, and Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The creature loomed closer, its form massive, its jagged silhouette barely visible through the black mist. Jason had to focus. He had to break free. He thought back to everything he had learned, everything he had endured. He thought of the house, the forest, the figure. He remembered how the darkness had tried to consume him, how it had tried to pull him under. But he had fought then. He had fought and survived. He had to do it again. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I'm not afraid. I won't let it take me." With everything he had, Jason focused, shutting his eyes to block out the blinding glow of the creature's eyes. He reached deep within himself, summoning all the strength he had left. The shadows that had once consumed him, the whispers that had filled his mind, they were nothing more than tricks, lies meant to make him doubt himself. The growl, louder than before, came again, but Jason wasn't afraid anymore. His chest swelled with defiance. He couldn't let it win. Not now. Jason opened his eyes, and the figure before him began to waver. Its shape before him began to waver, its shape flickering. The shadows, once so thick, began to peel away, fading into the air like smoke. The eyes that had once seemed to pierce his very soul began to flicker and dim. The darkness roared, but it was weak now. It was fading, losing its grip on him. Jason pushed forward, his strength growing with every step, every thought. And then, with one final effort, Jason let out a scream. The darkness screamed with him, a terrible, guttural cry that shook the ground beneath him. But he didn't stop. The figure crumbled, the shadows dissipating into nothing, and the coldness that had wrapped around him like a vice began to release its hold. Jason collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his heart racing as the last remnants of the darkness faded away. The glow in his mind dimmed, and he opened his eyes to find himself in the forest again. The air was still, the trees tall and silent, but the oppressive presence was gone. He was free, but as he stood up, his body sore, his mind heavy with the weight of everything he had endured, Jason knew one thing for certain. He would never truly be free from what had happened here. The darkness might have been banished for now, but it would always be there, waiting, and he would always carry the weight of this place with him. But for now, Jason was alive, and that was enough. Jason stood in the clearing, still catching his breath, the remnants of the darkness fading into the woods around him. He felt an eerie stillness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe he had escaped. Completely, finally, the oppressive presence was gone. The terrifying figure had dissolved into theatre shadows, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was quiet. The silence was almost peaceful, if it weren't for the overwhelming weight of what he had just endured. But deep down, Jason knew that peace was an illusion. The woods, the house, the strange voice. They weren't gone. They were still there, lingering in the corners of his mind. The forest around him was quiet, but it wasn't natural. It was too still, too empty, as though it were waiting for something for him to slip up. Jason took a tentative step forward, the familiar crunch of leaves underfoot now sounding too loud in the stillness. His feet felt heavy, weighed down by the fear that still clung to him, gnawing at the edges of Silfrid Taco. His thoughts. The faint glow of the lantern had disappeared, but the air was thick with something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the smell of the earth or the trees. It was something darker, something he couldn't shake off. He had survived the worst of it, but that didn't mean it was over. Suddenly, a soft rustle sounded from behind him. Jason froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his pulse quickened. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. The noise was deliberate, too controlled, too intentional. He spun around quickly, heart in his throat. The clearing behind him was still empty, the trees standing silently as they had before. No movement, no sound. Jason let out a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. But as he turned back, something caught his eye. A faint figure in the distance, just beyond the tree line. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw it more clearly. A shadow standing, he saw it more clearly, just at the edge of the trees, still a stone, watching him. His heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was as if it were frozen, observing him, waiting. Jason's body screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like way. They were rooted to the spot. Every instinct told him to flee, but something held him there, an invisible force that gripped him in place. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, an ominous silhouette against the thicker backdrop of the dark forest. Jason could feel its gaze on him, pressing down, suffocating him with its silent intensity. And then, slowly, it began to move. Not fast, just a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. Each step seemed to make the air around Jason grow heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in on him. Jason's breath quickened, panic rising in his chest as he backed away, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The figure didn't stop, its movements fluid and almost graceful, but its presence was suffocating. Jason could feel the weight of it, like it was an ancient force, timeless and inevitable. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure stopped. It stood there, still, waiting for Jason to make the next move. The silence was unbearable now, filling the space between them with tension. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. His legs were trembling, his hands shaking as he reached for the flashlight at his. But as he fumbled for it, something changed. The air, once so still, suddenly thickened, like something was pressing against him from all sides. The figure took one more step forward, and Jason's body froze. The movement was impossibly froze, slow, but it felt like a thunderclap in the quiet of the night. Jason, a voice whispered, a familiar voice, soft and haunting. He turned his head so fast it hurt, but no one was there. The figure hadn't moved its lips, yet he had heard it. Sarah's voice. Impossible. She was gone, wasn't she? She had disappeared into the shadows back in the woods, vanishing like everything else. There was no way she could be here now. Jason's hands shook uncontrollably as he turned back to face the figure. It wasn't Sarah. It couldn't be. Sarah, figure, now only a few feet away, raised its hand slowly, and in that moment, the world around Jason seemed to tilt, as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between reality and something far darker. The figure's voice filled his mind again, louder this time, a command rather than a whisper. You belong here. You always have. You cannot escape your fate. Jason stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't breathe. The air around him was thick with the presence of something ancient, something older than time itself. a force that wasn't simply out to kill him, it was out to claim him. And as he looked into the empty, glowing eyes of the figure, he knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The forest had never truly let him go. It had always been waiting for him to return. Jason stumbled back another step, his legs threatening to buckle beneath him as the weight of the figure's presence pressed in on him. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat more erratic than the last. The voice, the chilling voice, was echoing in his mind, repeating those same words over and over again. You belong here. You cannot escape your fate. His breath came in shallow gasps. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to back away, but the world around him felt as if it were shifting, closing in. The trees around him seemed to stretch taller, their gnarled branches twisting into shapes he couldn't understand. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, like it was about to collapse at any moment. The figure did not move. It stood perfectly still, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, its silhouette sharp and defined against the forest's eerie backdrop. It didn't speak again, but somehow, Jason felt its presence even more deeply now. It was as if the very air was saturated with its intent, with the power it held over him. Jason's mind raced. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this thing claim him. But the fear, the overwhelming sense of inevitability was suffocating. He had already fought once, hadn't he? He had faced the darkness and the forest's curse, and he had survived. So why did it feel like he was standing at the edge of something far worse now? The figure stepped forward, its movement so slow, it seemed almost impossible, but each step was deliberate, like it was drawing out Jason's fear, savoring it. With each passing moment, the shadows around them seemed to deepen, suffocating the space between them. You cannot fight me, the figure said, its voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate within Jason's very bones. You are already mine. The words cut through him like a blade. He could feel them, deep within his chest, twisting something inside him. He had come this far, and yet it felt like it was all slipping away. The darkness was still there, wrapping its fingers around his soul, pulling him into its grip. No, Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I won't let you take me, not again. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and Jason could feel it. This was the moment he either fought or succumbed. With a surge of fought or succumbed adrenaline, Jason turned and bolted into the trees. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to run. The forest had already swallowed him once, but not again. Not like this. His footsteps were frantic, crashing through the underbrush as he pushed his way through the dense trees. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, the rain having soaked the forest floor. He could hear the rustling of leaves, the snap of branches under his weight. But what terrified him more than the sound of his own panicked flight was the feeling of the figure behind him, its presence looming just out of sight. The lantern light flickered again, brighter this time, and Jason dared not look back. He couldn't afford to. He had to keep running, keep pushing forward. But the forest was shifting around him. He could feel it now. The trees were closing in. The branches stretched unnaturally low, blocking his path, and the ground seemed to shift, beneath his feet. He was disoriented, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, his mind clouded with panic. Every step forward felt like it took him deeper into the heart of the forest. But Jason couldn't stop. He had to get out. He had to escape. Then, ahead of him, he saw it, a break in the trees, the light of the moon shining through the gap. It was there, just ahead, the exit, the way out. But as he pushed toward it, A cold gust of wind slammed into him, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, his feet catching on the roots that seemed to grow from the ground itself, pulling him down, and when he hit the ground, the world around him shifted once again. The forest, the trees, the night, it all began to blur, the shadows twisted and bent, as if warping around him. The moonlight seemed to flicker, like it was being smothered by the blackness surrounding him. Jason tried to push himself up, but his body felt heavy, like the earth itself was pulling him back down. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The figure was there, standing just beyond the trees, its silhouette glowing eerily in the fading moonlight. The lantern's light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that crawled toward him, creeping like living things. "It's over, Jason," the voice came again, but now it wasn't just in his mind. It was in the air, surrounding him. "You belong to me. You always have." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse up erratic. He could feel the weight of the darkness around him, closing in, suffocating him. It was no longer just a presence. It was a part of him, a part of everything around him. The figure was the forest, the darkness, the very force that had haunted him since the moment he set foot here. And as the lantern's light burned brighter, more intense, Jason realized the truth. He wasn't running away from it. He had never been running away from it. The darkness, the figure, it had always been with him, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast, he would never truly escape. "You are mine," the voice whispered again, a low, deep hum that seemed to reverberate through his very soul. Jason's vision blurred as the darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness closed in around him, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around Jason like a heavy blanket. He tried to scream, but no sound left his mouth. His breath was shallow, his chest tight with the pressure of the unseen force that was crushing him. The air itself felt heavy, like it was pressing down on him from all sides, suffocating his very existence. The figure moved closer, its glowing eyes piercing through the blackness. Its glowing eyes piercing through the blackness. Its presence overwhelming. It was no longer just an entity. It was a force of nature, something ancient and terrifying, something that had always been here, waiting for him. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again. But this time, it was whispered again. But this time, it was no longer just a voice. It was everything, the wind, the trees, the very ground beneath him. It was all speaking to him, telling him the same thing: he was trapped. He had always been trapped. Jason's mind screamed, but the darkness held back him, kept him from thinking, from processing what was happening. It was too much, too overwhelming. But then, through the suffocating void, something broke through. A memory, a flash of light, a voice. "You can fight. You always can." It was Sarah's voice. The words felt like a lifeline, a thread of hope in the oppressive void that surrounded him. Jason's mind clung to it, the only thing that made sense. He had fought before. He had escaped before. He had to fight now. He had to fight now. Drew a deep breath, feeling the air burn in his lungs as he gathered every ounce of strength he had left. The weight of the darkness was still there, pressing down on him, but now it felt less suffocating. He could feel the edges of it. Grip loosening, just slightly. Jason's hand trembled, but he raised it, trying to break free from the hold. The figure's eyes burned brighter, its presence more overwhelming than ever, but Jason refused to let it win. He clenched his fists, trying to summon the power to push back against it. "You are not in control," the figure's voice echoed, now distant, as though it was faltering for the first time. It tried to drown him out, to keep him in the dark, but Jason could hear weakness in its voice. For the first time, The darkness didn't feel all-powerful. It felt vulnerable. Jason stepped forward, forcing himself to move despite the heaviness that still gripped him. The shadows writhed around him, lashing out, but he refused to be consumed by them again. The figure was no longer towering over him like a monster. It was just a presence, a part of this place. It was not invincible. "Not anymore. You cannot control me," Jason shouted. His voice, stronger than he felt, resonating through the darkness. The ground beneath him shifted, the shadows pulling back just enough to give him space to breathe. The figure stopped moving, its eyes still glowing, but now the light seemed weaker. Flickering as though it were running out of energy. The presence that had once seemed to loom over him like an inescapable doom was now shrinking, faltering. Jason took a step toward it, then another. He could feel the shift, the change. Power that had once held him captive was no longer unyielding. It was breaking, and with each step, the darkness pulled away, its grip loosening. You don't control me?" Jason said again, his voice trembling, but resolute. "I won't let you." The figure's form wavered. For the first time, it seemed to hesitate, its once clear shape starting to blur, its glowing eyes dimming. The presence in the air seemed to weaken with each passing moment, and then, with a final, piercing moment, and then, with a final, piercing scream that echoed through the void, the figure dissolved into nothing. The shadows faded, and the unnatural weight lifted from Jason's chest. The darkness, which had surrounded him, consumed him, and ruled him, was gone. Just like that, gone. Jason collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as the last remnants of the darkness evaporated into the night. His mind reeled from the intensity of what had just happened. He was alive. The fear, the suffocation, it was over. But it wasn't over in the way he expected. He looked around, and the forest that had once felt so twisted and alive with dark power now seemed normal. The trees stood tall and still, the night quiet and undisturbed. The lantern light that had once illuminated everything in its path was gone, leaving only the moonlight to guide him. Jason's body was shaking, his legs weak from the strain, but he forced himself to stand. The fight wasn't over, not really. He knew that this place, whatever it was, it would always be with him. The darkness that had taken hold of him was now a part of him, embedded in his soul, but it wouldn't control him, not anymore. With one final deep breath, Jason turned and began to walk away from the clearing, the forest silent behind him. The path was unclear, but the weight that had once held him back had lifted. He wasn't running anymore. He was walking forward, away from the past, toward whatever lay ahead, and for the first time, he felt free. Jason's footsteps were slow at first, his body still trembling from the aftershock of what he had just endured. Every part of him felt bruised, worn down, and exhausted, but there was a strange sense of clarity, a relief that spread through him. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, leaving him feeling both lighter and more vulnerable than he had ever felt before. The woods around him, once full of terror, now seemed oddly peaceful. The wind blew softly through the trees, and the leaves rustled in a way that was natural. Gently, Jason allowed himself a few moments to breathe, to feel the stillness in the air. For a brief, fleeting moment, he felt as if he might have made it, escaped whatever nightmare had haunted him. But deep down, he knew better. The truth was, the battle he had fought wasn't just about surviving this forest. It wasn't just about the figure with the lantern. No, this was only part of a much bigger with the lantern story, one that had been unfolding for much longer than he realized. The forest seemed endless now. The path that had once seemed familiar was now foreign to him. The trees, their bark twisted and ancient, towered overhead, their shadows stretching long across the ground. The moon was high in the sky, but it offered little comfort, just casting its pale light onto the eerie landscape around him. Jason's mind began to drift. He thought of Sarah, of the figure he had seen. The one that had tricked him into believing it was her. It had all felt so real, so convincing. Had she been trying to warn him? Or had she, too, been a victim of whatever force controlled this place? But then, a thought hit him, chilling him to his core. What if Sarah hadn't been a victim at all? What if she had been part of it, leading him deeper into the trap? Had she been trying to help him? Or was she the one who had brought him here in the first place? Jason shook his head. It didn't matter now. He was alive, and he had to move forward. The path ahead remained unclear, but one thing was certain. He could no longer stay in the forest. He had to find a way out, back to the world he knew. But the further he walked, the more the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around him. The air felt thicker, heavier with each step. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Jason's pace quickened, the panic slowly creeping back into his chest. He couldn't afford to stop. He had to get out of here. A sound broke through the silence, faint at first, but unmistakable. Behind him, Jason stopped dead in his tracks. His pulse thundered in his ears. He turned slowly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the shadows, stretching out in the moonlight, the wind whispering through the branches. He stood in the branches, still, listening, waiting. The silence stretched on, too long, and then, there it was, again, the rustling, now louder, more insistent. Jason's stomach turned as he turned back toward the path. Heart pounded faster now. He took a step forward, then another, moving faster, his footsteps echoing through the stillness. But no matter how fast he moved, the sound seemed to follow him. The rustling, the faint whispers, the soft footfalls just behind him, growing closer with every passing moment. Jason's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he ran, the fear rising inside him like a wave, pushing him forward. But he didn't dare look back. The sounds were getting louder, more distinct, but there was no time to turn and confront whatever was behind him. He had to get out. And then, through the trees, Jason saw it. A figure standing in the distance, just ahead of him. It was barely visible in the dim or distorted light, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A tall, shadowy figure, standing motionless in the middle of the path. Jason froze. His heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring ahead. Its presence was overwhelming, like it was made of the very shadows around him, its shape almost blending into the night itself. Who are you? Jason called out, his voice shaking, but the figure didn't answer. It didn't even acknowledge him. Jason took a hesitant step forward, and the figure did not move. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something wrong about the way it stood there, unmoving, silent. Another step, then another. The closer Jason got, the colder the air seemed to grow, and the more the figure's outline seemed to shimmer, like a mirage in the night. He could see its eyes now, dark, empty, glowing faintly in the dark. Suddenly, without warning, the figure turned, its movement so swift and fluid that Jason barely had time to react. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, suffocating him as the shadows seemed to stretch toward him, closing in from all sides. Jason spun around to run, but his feet seemed to be caught in the mud, the ground sucking him down, pulling him into the earth. His eyes darted back to the figure, but it was gone. In the blink of an eye, it was gone, had vanished into the trees, leaving only the eerie silence in its wake. Jason gasped for air, his chest tight, his body trembling. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, the blood rushing through his veins as he fought to pull his feet free from the earth's grasp. But no matter how hard he tried, the pull of the darkness, the force of the woods, kept him tethered here. He could feel the eyes on him again, hidden in the shadows, just out of reach, but always there, watching. The forest had never truly let him go. He wasn't free, and whatever was following him, whatever had been watching him from the beginning, would never stop. Jason's heart raced as the fear gripped him once more. His feet were still caught, but he fought against the heavy pull of the earth, his limbs heavy, as though the very ground beneath him had become something else, alive, sentient. He could feel its cold tendrils wrapping around his ankles, tightening with every movement. His ankles, tightening with every movement. His chest tightened, and his breath came in shallow, frantic gasps. He had to get out, he had to run. But the moment he tried to step forward, the shadows seemed to lash out, stretching toward him, and his feet were stuck even deeper. The rustling in the trees behind him grew louder, closer. The whispering voices that had filled his mind before were now louder, more insistent. They swirled around him, creating a cacophony of sound that blurred into one overwhelming, oppressive wave. You belong here. You cannot escape. We are watching. Jason's mind spun, but there was no time to think, no time to question what was happening. He had to move. He had to survive. His hands trembled as he tried to push himself forward, but the ground seemed to resist him. The shadows grew darker, pressing against him, and the air became thick, suffocating. He could barely breathe, the weight of the forest closing in around him like a vice. The whispers began around him like a vice, again, echoing in his ears, rising to a fever pitch. The shadows swirled violently, creating figures just beyond his sight, moving in the dark, too fast to be real. Jason screamed, a guttural sound that rang out through the forest, but no one would hear him. There was no one, only the darkness with a final surge of desperation. He tore his feet from the grip of the earth, running with everything he had. His heart pounded, his legs burning as he stumbled over roots and branches, not caring where he went, just needing to escape. The rustling behind him followed, growing louder, faster. Something was chasing him. The trees around him seemed to blur as he ran, the path twisting, distorting. It wasn't just in the forest anymore. It was like the very land had shifted, trapping him in its web. The lantern's light from earlier flickered in the distance again, faint but unmistakable, like a guiding light. Jason pushed forward, following it. The shadows seemed to recede with each step he took toward it, and for a brief moment, he thought he could break free. Then, as he neared the light, a sudden, sharp pain pierced through his chest, as if something had reached into him. "Heart?" Jason gasped, stumbling to the ground, his body racked with a wave of nausea. The lantern flickered, and the figure appeared again, closer this time, standing directly in his path. "You cannot leave," the figure said, its voice a deep, resonating hum that filled the air. Its eyes glowed brighter now, piercing through the darkness like two burning embers. Jason struggled to breathe, his chest tight with panic. He tried to move, tried to fight back, but his limbs felt like they were frozen in place. The shadows around him seemed to pulse, their tendrils creeping closer, as if they were consuming him. "You will never escape," the figure said again, its voice like a command. It stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating, and Jason felt the darkness close in on him. His vision blurred, the shadows growing darker and darker, until all he could see were those glowing eyes. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, and Jason screamed. But the sound was lost in the void. The shadows swallowed him whole, the force of the darkness pulling him under. He struggled, gasping for air, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank. The figure's eyes were the last thing he saw before. Everything went black. Jason woke up, gasping for air, his body jerking upright, his chest heaved, his breath ragged, as he looked around in a panic. The forest was gone. The shadows, the figure, they were all gone. He was in a room now. A small, dimly lit room with walls that were peeling, covered in dark stains. He looked down and realized he was lying on a bed, old, tattered sheets beneath him. But the most unsettling thing wasn't the room. It was the smell. The stale air. The sense of being trapped. He wasn't outside anymore. He wasn't in the forest. Where am I? Jason whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. He stood up, shaking, and approached the door. But before he could reach for the knob, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a phone ringing. Jason froze, his blood running cold as the ringing "Jason!" echoed through the room, loud and intrusive. He knew that sound. It was the same sound that had haunted him in the woods, the same ringing that had preceded everything. The figure, the darkness, the voices. He turned slowly toward the desk in the corner where an old rotary phone sat, its black receiver lifted slightly, as though it had been waiting for him. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The phone stopped ringing. There was silence. And then, the voice, "Jason." "It then," whispered, the voice low and haunting. It sent chills down his spine. He turned toward the phone, but he didn't dare approach it. He couldn't. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching in all directions. He escaped the forest, yes. But whatever this was, whatever force was controlling his every move, was still here. Jason backed away from the phone, his mind racing, his heart beating erratically. He needed to leave. He needed to escape. But the white room felt like it was closing in, the air thick with the presence of something. Someone. Something he couldn't fight anymore. And then, the phone rang again. "Jason, it's not over." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quick ended in his chest, shallow as he stood frozen in front of the phone. The voice still lingered in his mind, reverberating like an echo he couldn't escape. "It's not over." The words seemed to hang in the air, like a promise, a curse. He wanted to leave, wanted to run from this place, this nightmare that had taken over his mind, his life. But the walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with something he couldn't name. The phone rang again, and this time, Jason felt it in his bones. The compulsion to answer was overwhelming. He walked toward the phone slowly, his legs heavy with fear, his mind battling with the need to break free from whatever grip this place had on him. Closer he got, the louder the voice became, louder in his head, until it felt like the very air was vibrating with it. "Pick up the phone, Jason," it whispered, the voice soft but unyielding. His hand trembled as he reached for the receiver. The moment his fingers touched it, the room seemed to shudder, the walls groaning as if the very building was alive. The air was electric with tension, and Jason knew that this wasn't just about answering a phone. This was the last test, the final confrontation with whatever force had been tormenting him since he first set foot in the woods. He lifted the receiver to his ear, and for a moment, everything was still. The phone crackled in his ear, the static making his skin crawl. And then, the voice came again. "Jason, you thought you could escape? You can never escape what's inside you." Jason closed his eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to shut it all out. But it was too late. He felt the coldness in his soul. the darkness that had been waiting for him, hiding just beneath the surface, now creeping back, taking hold. He dropped the phone, his hand shaking as it hit the desk with a loud clang. He staggered back, gasping for breath, his mind swirling with confusion and terror. The room seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching longer, darker. The walls seemed to close in on him, tighter and tighter, until the air was thick, suffocating. "You can't hide," the voice continued, filling the room, surrounding him. "You belong to me, to this place, forever." Jason's knees buckled and he fell to the floor, his head spinning. The darkness was coming for him again. He could feel it, creeping into his chest, wrapping around his heart. The world around him seemed to tilt, like he was falling into an abyss that would never end. But then, just as quickly as it had all started, the pressure lifted. The air around him grew still, the shadows retreating, the voice fading into silence. Jason's breathing was erratic. His hands' breathing was erratic, his hands shaking as he pushed himself off the floor, his vision blurred, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. And then, as if in response to his thoughts, a door creaked open on the far side of the room. Jason turned slowly, his heart racing once more. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the forest, the one with the glowing eyes. But now, it was different. It wasn't just an entity from the woods. It was here, in this room, staring at him with that same cold, hungry gaze. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply watched. Jason knew, in that moment, that it had always been with him, always watching, always waiting. And just as it had once promised, he could never escape. Jason's heart sank into his chest as he stared at the figure in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on him. The room, once filled with the unbearable pressure of the voice and shadows, had suddenly become chillingly silent, but the oppressive presence remained. The air around him felt thick with dread, as if the very walls were closing in on him. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure didn't advance. It didn't need to. Its presence alone filled the room. Swallowing the space, drowning him in its darkness. Jason tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a dry rasp as the weight of what he was facing settled in. "You're too late," the figure whispered in his mind, its voice low and cold, though its lips didn't move. "You've always been too late." Jason's chest tightened, the room seeming to collapse in on him. The weight of the figure's gaze was unbearable, as though it could see straight into his soul, reading every fear, every regret he had buried deep within. He had felt its pull from the moment he entered the forest, had felt its gaze from afar. But now, standing face to face with it, he understood. This was not just something that had come for him. This was something ancient, something that had been waiting for him, just as much a part of this place as the trees, the shadows, the night. "You can't have me," Jason finally managed to say, his voice rough, his mind foggy with fear, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I won't be yours." The figure's eyes burned brighter, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Jason thought he could see something else. Something far worse. Flickering beneath the surface, it was like the figure was merely a mask, a facade, hiding something darker, something older. "You were never meant to escape," the figure said, its voice seeping into Jason's thoughts once more. "You belong to this place, Jason. You always have. You always will." Jason closed his eyes, shaking his head, trying to block out the voice. It was too much. He felt as though his mind was splitting, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. Thought of Sarah, of the others. But it didn't matter now. The forest had been more than just a place. It had been a trap, and he had walked right into it. His body felt weak, and the shadows around him seemed to creep closer, curling around his feet like tendrils of smoke. But then something changed. The figure in the doorway stood still, its form shimmering for a moment, as though it were flickering between two worlds. Jason blinked, and in that split second, the figure was gone. The room was no longer suffocating. The air, while heavy, felt lighter, like the dark presence had been lifted. If only for a moment. Jason staggered back, disoriented, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. He looked around the grass. What had just happened? The shadows no longer pressing in on him. It was still, quiet, too quiet. And yet, Jason felt an uneasy sense of emptiness. The darkness is never truly gone. The voice whispered again, but this time it was fainter, more distant, as if the figure was losing its power over him. You cannot escape what you've become. Jason shook his head, his mind finally clearing. He realized now that the figure wasn't just a force he could fight. It was a part of him, of everything he had experienced in the forest. It was his own fear, his own doubt, his own darkness manifesting. And as long as he let it control him, it would always have power. But in that moment, Jason understood. The figure had come to show him something, to show him the truth. It wasn't the forest that had held him captive. It wasn't the figure itself that had been the threat. It had been his own fear, his own inability to confront the darkness inside of him. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything lift from his chest. The room was still dark, still strange, but he wasn't trapped anymore. The darkness had no more hold over him. He would not let it control him. The door in front of him creaked open, the hinges groaning as if inviting him to leave. Jason hesitated, his heart pounding, but the fear was gone now. He had faced it, had stood in the face of his own worst nightmare, and survived. With a final glance around the room, Jason stepped forward, pushing the door open and into the unknown. The forest was no longer the place of horror it had once been. It was just a forest, silent, still, and Jason knew, deep within his soul, that the darkness would never fully let go of him. But he also knew that he had the strength to fight it now. The forest, the figure, the fear. None of it had power over him anymore. Jason walked forward, the path ahead uncertain, but the weight of his fear no longer shackling him. The journey had been long, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Jason had finally broken free, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe again. The darkness would always be there, lurking in the corners of his haze mind, but it no longer controlled him. And as he stepped into the quiet night, Jason knew this. The fight was over, for now. It was an ordinary evening when Sarah received the phone call that would change her life. She had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, a place with history, or so she was told. The house had been empty for years, with rumors of the house had been empty for years, with rumors of strange occurrences and eerie sounds coming from within its walls. But Sarah wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. She was rational, a person of science, and she believed that everything had an explanation. She had settled into the house quickly, eager for a fresh start, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. But something was off. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't entirely alone, even when there was no one else in sight. The phone call came late in the evening, just as Sarah was preparing for bed. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but strangely calm. "Sarah," the voice said, "you don't know me, but I know you. I know what's in that house. I know what's watching you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't told anyone where she was living, so how could this person know anything about her house? She felt a cold shiver run down her spine as the voice continued. "It's not what you think. The house is alive. And the thing inside, it has eyes. Eyes that cannot see, but it can still see you." Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. She stood frozen in place, heart pounding, as the silence of the house settled in around her. She tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, but the next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. At night, she would hear footsteps in there. "So, it's you will tries and nay, royal rouse. I don't know what, you know I was bridge in the office hallway when she knew she was alone. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, just out of reach, and in the dead of night, she would wake to the sound of breathing, heavy and slow, coming from the hallway outside her bedroom door. Sarah tried to tell herself that it was just the house settling, that her imagination was running wild. But every night, the strange happenings grew more intense, more real. One evening, after hearing another set of footsteps in the hallway, Sarah decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and walked down the dark, narrow corridor that led to the old attic. The house felt colder than usual, as if the air itself was thick with something unseen. As she approached the attic door, she froze. A soft scratching sound echoed from behind it, like something or someone was trying to get out with trembling hands. Sarah opened the door. The attic was dark, save for the faint beam of light from her flashlight. She, for the faint beam of light from her flashlight, stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. And that's when she saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. The eyes weren't human. They weren't even animal. They were something else, something unnatural. Something unnatural, something that should not exist. They stared at her, unmoving, unblinking. But they didn't need to blink. The eyes saw everything. She backed away, but the eyes followed her every move, as if they were reading her, sensing her fear, her hot breath caught in her throat as a chilling, low voice echoed through the room, a voice that didn't come from any mouth. "Leave. Before it's too late," the voice whispered, its tone cold and distant. "It has seen you." Suddenly, the eyes whispered, its tone cold and distant. "It has seen you." Suddenly, the eyes vanished, fading into the shadows, leaving Sarah in the silence of the attic. She stumbled backward, her heart racing, the cold sweat drenching her skin. She had to get out of the house. But as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her chest as she fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The air grew thick and heavy, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the darkness around her. Breathing in the darkness around her. Walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching, reaching for her. And then she heard it, the scratching again. Louder this time, closer. Something was coming, something that could see her, even without eyes. Sarah's only thought now was survival. She had to escape, but the house wouldn't let her. The darkness was growing, and the eyes, those horrible, unseeing eyes, were still watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. And that was when she realized the terrible truth. She would never leave the house. Not now. Not ever. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to breathe in the thickening air. Every instinct told her to run, to escape. But the house seemed to reject her every movement. Walls creaked. The floorboards groaned. and the scratching sound that had once been distant now echoed in her ears, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. She turned back to the attic door, her hand shaking as she tried the attic door. Her hand shaking as she tried the handle again. But it was useless. It wouldn't budge. The house wasn't just locking her in. It was holding her, trapping her in its cold, suffocating embrace. It was as if the house itself was alive, its very structure reacting to her presence. Her flashlight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. She could feel the eyes again, those glowing, unblinking eyes, watching her from the dark corners of the room. They weren't just in the attic. They were in every corner of the house. Every shadow, every flicker of light, they were everywhere, and they were waiting. "Why won't you leave?" a voice echoed through her mind. Soft and seductive. It was the voice she had heard before. The one from the phone call. The voice of the thing that haunted this house. "You belong here. Sarah, we've been waiting for you." She slammed her fist against the door, her mind racing for an escape. But there was no way out. The house had sealed her in, trapping her in this nightmare. Panic surged through her, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her vision blurred. And for a moment, she thought she saw the shadows shifting in the corners of the room, as if something was moving just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dark, standing still in the far corner of the attic. Its shape was distorted, shifting in the shadows like a grotesque reflection of something human. The figure had no eyes, no visible features, only a dark, hollow shape, but it was watching her. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and before she could react, the figure moved. It wasn't fast, just a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another, and another. Her blood ran cold as the thing drew closer, its form becoming clearer with each step. It was becoming clearer with each step. It was alive, but it wasn't human. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like it was struggling to hold itself together. Suddenly, the figure's eyes appeared, but they weren't eyes at all. They were just dark, hollow spaces, swirling with an inky eyes. "Ways are you would chew," blackness that seemed to draw her in, consuming her thoughts. Her vision blurred again, and her legs gave way beneath her as she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. "No," she whispered, her voice weak. "I don't belong here. I don't belong here." The figure stepped closer, its dark presence suffocating, surrounding her with a coldness that chilled her to the bone. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on her from all sides, and the room began to spin. She could hear the whispers now, soft and unintelligible, swirling in the air around her. They were coming from the walls, from the shadows, from everywhere. She tried to stand, but her limbs felt heavy, numb. She couldn't move. The thing in front of her was getting closer, its form now almost tangible, as if it was made of the very shadows themselves. It was coming for her. No matter how hard she fought, she couldn't escape. Then the voice spoke again. But this time, it wasn't in her mind. It was right behind her, like a breath on her neck. "You are ours." Sarah turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the dark emptiness of the room. The figure had vanished, but she could feel it, standing behind her, just out of sight. She could feel the weight of its presence, like a physical pressure pressing down on her chest. It was no longer just in the attic. It was inside her, in her mind, in her soul. The house was alive, and it had chosen her. The scratching noise started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from within the walls, from the floorboards, from everywhere. The house itself was moving, shifting, closing in on her, drawing her deeper into its web. "No!" she screamed, trying to stand, trying to run, but the floor beneath her feet was buckling. The walls were closing in. The shadows were pulling her down, suffocating her. The voice came again, louder this time, filling her mind, filling her mind, filling her mind. "Oh, you are part of it now, forever. There is no escape." And as the darkness swallowed her whole, Sarah realized the terrible truth. The house had never let her go. It had never wanted to. She had always belonged to it, and now there was no way out. The darkness tightened around her, a cold, suffocating grip that seemed to crush the air from her lungs. The last vestiges of her thoughts were dissolving, lost in the shadowy abyss that was closing in on her. Her vision dimmed, her body feeling weightless, as if she were being pulled downward, deeper into the earth, into the very bones of the house itself. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. Her mouth opened, but her voice was stolen by the ever-encroaching blackness. It was as if the walls had become alive, closing in on her, bending the reality of the space itself. The house was shifting, warping, and Sarah was no longer sure if she was standing in the attic or falling through time itself. She couldn't tell what was real anymore. Suddenly, the pressure eased just a little. Sarah's feet found solid ground, but only for a moment. The floor beneath her began to ripple like water, a surreal and nauseating effect, as if the house had turned into a living organism with its own pulse, its own heartbeat. She looked around, her eyes struggling to adjust to the flickering dim light from the broken lantern on the floor. The shadowy corners of the attic seemed to pulse and breathe, shadows stretching and twisting unnaturally, as if they were aware of her every movement. The air felt thick with something unseen, a presence that was always there, lingering at the edge of her perception. She felt eyes on her again, eyes that weren't human, but ancient and cold, watching her from every shadow, from the depths of the house. It wasn't just the figure she had seen earlier. The presence she had felt had expanded, become something far more immense, filling every inch of the attic and stretching far beyond its walls. Then she saw it, a door. It was tucked into the farthest corner of the attic, half hidden by shadows, but it wasn't a door she had seen before. It looked ancient, the wood weathered and cracked, the frame twisted, almost as if it had been a part of the house for centuries, waiting. The moment Sarah saw it, she knew she had to open it. Her body moved on its own, her feet taking her toward the door without her mind fully understanding why. It felt like a pull, like the house itself was guiding her, drawing her to it. She hesitated for a brief second before reaching out, her trembling fingers brushing against the cold wood of the door. The touch sent a jolt through her body, like an electric shock, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. She had to open it. With a sudden burst of strength, the door creaked open, revealing what lay beyond it. But as she stepped forward, something cold and unseen gripped her wrist, stopping her dead in her tracks. A whisper filled the air, not from the house, but from within her mind. "You were never meant to open it." Her heart stopped for a moment, her chest tightening, as the voice tapped for a moment, her chest tightening, as the voice echoed around her. The door, whatever was behind it, was not meant for her to see. She was not supposed to know what lay beyond, but it was too late. The door opened fully, and Sarah was pulled through it, her body lurching forward into the dark abyss that awaited her on the other side. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air became cold, unnaturally cold. A darkness thicker than any night she had ever experienced wrapped itself around her. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, as if the very atmosphere were alive, trying to choke the life out of her. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she stumbled forward. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in. For a moment, Sarah couldn't see anything. Her eyes were blinded by the absolute blackness that surrounded her. But then, slowly, shapes began to form. Strange, twisted shapes that seemed to move, to shift and pulsate in the darkness. The air grew heavier, denser, until it denser, until it felt like she was wading through something thick and viscous. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. And then she saw it, an endless hallway stretching out before her, disappearing into the unknown. The walls were covered in symbols, arcane, twisted markings that seemed to shift as her gaze fell upon them. They seemed alive, pulsating with energy, with something far older and more malevolent than anything Sarah could ever have imagined. The walls closed in around. The walls closed in around her, and she realized, with a cold shiver creeping up her spine, that she was no longer in the house. She was in something far worse. Something ancient. Something designed to trap souls like hers. The darkness began to whisper again. But this began to whisper again. But this time it wasn't a voice. It was 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison, each one as cold and soulless as the last. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome to the place where time ends and souls are lost. Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed, and she collapsed to the floor, her body shaking with fear. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening around her, as if the very space was bending, reshaping itself to consume her. In the distance, she saw movement. A figure, distorted and moving in the shadows, was approaching her. She could see its glowing eyes, cold and unblinking, watching her, waiting. And then, for the first time, she realized the truth. She was never meant to leave. This place wasn't a house. It wasn't just a forest. It was a prison, an eternal one, and she was its newest inmate. The figure in the shadows moved closer, its form more defined now, though still shrouded in an unnatural mist. Sarah tried to stand, but her body was too weak, too overwhelmed by the weight of the place. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, and the whispering voices were louder now, as though they were crawling into her very mind. The figure stepped forward, its steps deliberate, slow. The closer it came, the more detail Sarah could make out. Its eyes glowed an eerie shade of pale blue, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a twisted, empty mass, the features not fully formed, but instead constantly shifting, changing, as if it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was silenced by the overwhelming presence of the figure. It stood before her now, and as it did, a deep, guttural sound filled the air, a low hum vibrating through her bones. Shaking her to the core, "You are here now," the figure said, its voice not coming from its mouth but from the air around her, in the very walls of this place. "You belong here, Sarah. You always have." The words struck her like a physical blow, her body recoiling from the impact, though her legs refused to move. The weight of its words settled on her chest, suffocating her, and the room seemed to close in further, the walls tightening around her, as if the space itself was alive, reacting to her fear. You're not real," Sarah whispered. Though the words felt weak in her mouth, she didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept what she was seeing, but deep down, she knew the truth. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused by her words. "Oh, I am real as you are now, as real as you are now, as real as everything in this place. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The walls seemed to ripple like water, and the ground beneath Sarah's feet began to tremble. Her heart raced, the cold sweat on her skin freezing as the figure's presence grew even more intense. There was no escaping this. The very place around her seemed to be closing in, not just physically, but mental. It was as if this dimension, this nightmare world, was warping her reality. The whispering voices grew louder, filling her ears until they drowned out everything else. They weren't just speaking in a language she could understand. They were speaking inside her, crawling into her very thoughts, infecting her mind with their lies. They whispered about her past, about things she had never wanted to remember. They twisted her memories, turned them into dark, twisted versions of themselves. "You've always been here," they hissed. "You've always belonged to us. Your fear, your doubts, they've led you here, and now you can never leave." Terror coursed through her veins, but even as the words of the voices filled her head, something deep inside her fought back. She had faced fear before. She had faced darkness before, and she had survived with all the strength she could muster. Sarah shoved herself up from the ground, her legs shaking beneath her. She tried to run, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and undulate, as though it were alive. Every step she took felt as if she was sinking deeper into the very fabric of the nightmare. The figure's glowing eyes watched her, unmoving, its gaze never leaving her for a moment. It didn't need to move. It didn't need to move. It didn't need to chase her. The house, this place, was its prison as much as it was hers. You can't escape," the voice echoed around her, again and again, until the sound of her own thoughts was drowned out. "You can't outrun your fate." But Sarah wouldn't stop. She wouldn't let herself be consumed by this darkness. With every ounce of willpower she had left, she pushed herself forward, toward the flickering light in the distance. Something, anything, that might be an exit, a way out of this nightmare. And then, just as she thought she might make it, just as the light grew closer, she felt a cold, clammy hand grasp her wrist, pulling her back into the depths of the shadows. The grip was firm, unyielding, and as she was dragged back into the darkness, the figure spoke again. "You were never meant to leave. The house around her seemed to pulse with life, as if it was breathing with her, feeding off her fear. The walls closed in, the shadows wrapping around her like chains, tightening with every breath she took. The light she had seen, was it real? Or had it been just another illusion, another lie in this endless nightmare? She fought against the grip, clawing at the air, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. It was inside her now. It had always been inside her. From the very first moment she stepped into the house, from the very first time she heard the whispers. And just as she felt herself slip into the blackness, just as she felt herself being consumed by the cold, suffocating void, she realized something. The house wasn't just a place. It was part of her. Along, her scream was lost to the void, and the darkness claimed her. As Sarah's mind drifted into the depths of the darkness, her body no longer felt her own. The sensation of being pulled into something greater, something alive, overwhelmed her. The weight of the shadows wrapped themselves around her soul, drowning out every remaining thought. But then, something unexpected happened. A cold wind rushed through the space, slicing through the oppressive heat of the shadows. The air shifted, and for the first time since she entered this nightmare, the grip around her loosened, just for a moment. It was as if something outside of the house, outside of this place, had reached in to touch her, to offer her a fleeting chance to touch her, break free. Sarah's breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. She wasn't sure where the light was coming from, but she could see it, faint, like a distant glow at the end of a long tunnel. It flickered, then brightened, and she knew. This was her chance. The figure, still lurking just behind her, stood motionless, watching her every move. Its eyes glowed even brighter now, like burning embers, cold and empty, full of judgment. But Sarah didn't care. She had a sliver of hope, and that was enough. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed forward, crawling, dragging her body toward the light. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, each movement slow and painful, but the pull of the light grew stronger. Her body responded, as though it were no longer her own, as though the light had some power over her, pulling her toward it with a force she couldn't explain. But as Sarah moved, something else happened. The darkness fought back. The shadows stirred, crawling along the floor like serpents, twisting and writhing, reaching for her. The whispering voices returned, louder, more insistent than before. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You are ours," her chest as the cold hands of the darkness reached for her ankles, dragging her back, pulling her into the inky void. The light was now dimming, the path to freedom closing as the shadows fought against her with an almost unnatural determination. "You will never leave," the voice from the figure echoed again. "You are part of us now. There is no escape." Sarah's eyes darted back to the dark figure standing in the distance. The glowing eyes were filled with malicious triumph, as if it had won. But Sarah refused to accept that. She wouldn't let it win. She couldn't. With everything she had left, Sarah pushed forward again. The light was still there, still flickering in the distance, like a beacon of salvation. She fought against the dark forces pulling her back, each movement feeling like an eternity. Then, something strange happened. The shadows paused. For a brief moment, everything was still. The whispers faded. The hands of the darkness released their grip. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, her pulse racing. This silence, this absence of the dark forces that had tormented her, felt wrong, too quiet. Slowly, she stood, her body trembling as she looked around. The figure was gone. The shadows had retreated, just a little. The path to the light was open, but as Sarah took another step toward the light, she felt a cold presence behind her. She knew, deep down, that whatever this force was, this evil, it wasn't gone. It had merely retreated, waiting, watching. Still, Sarah moved forward. There was no turning back now. The light grew brighter as she reached it, its warmth washing over her, chasing away the shadows. And then, just as she thought she could step into it, a loud, deafening screech filled the air. The walls seemed to pulse with an intense, painful pressure, like the very fabric of reality was about to tear. The light flickered. The shadows crept back, wrapping around her, threatening to pull her back into the abyss. She was almost there, almost free. But then the light flickered out. Everything went black. The blackness swallowed her whole. The absence of light was like a weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her with its depth. Sarah could feel the coldness seep into her very bones, and for a moment she thought she had been pulled back into the depths of the house, the place where time and space no longer made sense. The warmth of a phrase. The light was gone, and with it, the hope she had clung to so desperately. But then, just as suddenly as the light had gone out, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The shadows seemed to quiver, as though they were alive, watching her. And then, she heard it. A voice. distant but clear, coming from the far reaches of the darkness. "You cannot escape us, Sarah." The voice echoed through the void, its tone cold and final, as if it was a decree, a sentence. The shadows around her seemed to stretch and grow, rising up from the floor, from the walls, from every corner of the room. They pressed in on her, threatening to consume her entirely, but in the very depths of the darkness, Sarah felt something else. A flicker, a tiny sliver of light, so faint she wasn't sure it was real, but it was there, just beyond her reach, like a distant star in an endless void. Without thinking, Sarah moved toward it. Her body was weak, her limbs heavy, but she felt ready. But she was weak, her limbs heavy, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to move. She had to reach that light. It was the only thing that had the power to pull her out of this endless darkness. As she moved closer, the shadows around her seemed to press harder, as though they were trying to force her back. But Sarah pushed through, using every ounce of willpower to break free. The light grew brighter as she reached it, and for a brief moment, she felt warmth, something she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. And then, she stepped into it. The moment she crossed the threshold, the darkness evaporated, melting away like smoke in the air. The oppressive weight that had been crushing her chest lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The shadows receded, fading into nothingness, and the air around her was light, crisp, and full of life. She looked around, and to her astonishment, she found herself standing in a different place altogether. The room she was in was unfamiliar, but it wasn't the same as the house she had been trapped in. It wasn't dark, oppressive, or suffocating. It was bright, clean, and warm. The walls were covered in warm, soft hues, and the soft glow of sunlight poured in from the windows. She could hear the chirping of birds outside, the sound of wind rustling the leaves of trees. It was peaceful, but something wasn't right. As Sarah looked around, she noticed the walls were lined with mirrors. Tall, ornate mirrors, all facing toward her, and in each mirror, she saw herself, standing, breathing, alive, but something was off. Her reflection wasn't quite her. In each mirror, Sarah saw the faintest trace of a shadow following her movements, creeping just behind her in every reflection. No matter which direction she turned, the shadow was there, lurking, waiting. Its form was twisted, unnaturally stretched, and its presence was unmistakable. "You're never truly free, Sarah," the voice whispered, echoing once more, but this time it came from every reflection. Sarah turned in a circle, her breath quickening. She reached out toward the mirrors, but the reflections didn't move as she did. Instead, they stood still, watching her, as if they were waiting for her to make the next move. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and in an instant, the mirrors shattered, their pieces falling to the ground like raindrops of glass. The room plunged into darkness once more, and the coldness returned, more intense, more suffocating than before. But this time, Sarah didn't panic. She had faced the darkness before. She had fought against it, and she could do it again. With every step she took forward, she could do it again. With every step she took forward, focused on that faint sliver of light, that promise of freedom. And as she stepped back into the light, she realized that the fight was far from over. But now, she was ready. This was just another beginning, another challenge she would face head on. The darkness would never fully let her go, but she would never let it consume her. Not again. As Sarah stepped into the light once more, the oppressive darkness surrounding her seemed to recede just slightly, but she knew this wasn't the end. The air still felt heavy, as if something lingered just beyond her reach. The voice, that haunting whisper, still echoed in the corners of her mind, though it was quieter now, like a fading echo from a distant memory. The room around her seemed to shift, its warm, peaceful appearance flickering like a mirage. The light that had once been so comforting now felt distant, almost unreachable, and the mirrors, the shattered shards of glass, lay scattered across the floor, gleaming with a cold, unnatural light. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still there, lurking just outside her sight, watching her every movement. The floor beneath her feet creaked as she moved, and with every step creaked as she moved, and with every step she took, the air seemed to grow colder. She could feel a presence, something ancient and unseen, pressing against her back. She wasn't alone. She could never escape the house. Its walls, its floors, its very foundations had been built with something far darker in mind. But Sarah couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The path ahead of her was unclear, the shadows in the corners of the room twisting like tendrils of smoke. But Sarah knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let her the darkness consume her again. She couldn't, not after everything she had endured. As she moved forward, the walls began to close in again, this time slowly, deliberately. The once expansive space around her was shrinking. The oppressive space around her was shrinking. The oppressive weight of the house returning with each passing moment. The whispers returned as well, louder now, filling her ears with their maddening chorus. "You're never leaving. You belong to us. You are part of us now." But Sarah didn't falter. She kept moving, her heart pounding in her chest, the terror clawing at her throat. She could feel the coldness on her skin, the suffocating presence of the darkness closing in around her. The walls, once welcoming and familiar, now seemed to invisible. Sees to you is proud be just accused. Now seemed to loom over her like towering giants, their jagged edges pressing in on her from all sides. And then, just as she thought she couldn't go any further, she saw it. A door, hidden in the farthest corner of the room, almost obscured by the shadows. It was small, unassuming, but something about it drew her in. The door wasn't locked, wasn't barred. It was open, as if waiting for her to walk through it. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this her way out, or was it another illusion? Another cruel trick played by the house? Sarah didn't care. She moved toward the door, ignoring the whispers that swirled around her, the growing pressure that pushed against her chest. She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling as she wrapped her fingers around the cold metal. As she opened the door, she stepped into the unknown. The moment she crossed the threshold, a wave of cold air hit her like a slap to the face. The room she had entered was unlike any she had seen before. It was an endless hallway. It was an endless hallway, stretching out before her, its walls lined with old, worn doors. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had walked this path in years. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of things left to rot for far too long. The things left to rot for far too long. Sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, but Sarah couldn't see where it was coming from. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The doors on either side all closed, their surfaces chipped and weathered. Each door seemed to have its stained. It says to be half for a line. It's dark. It's the way until it things its own mystery, its own history, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread as she looked at them. But she had to keep moving. She couldn't stop now. She had come too far. As she walked down the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop, With every step she took, her breath came out in clouds, her skin prickling with the coldness that now surrounded her. She reached out to touch one of the doors, her fingers brushing against the rough wood, but the moment her hand made contact, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, and the door shook violently as though something, or someone, was trying to get out. Sarah jumped back, her heart racing, but before she could react, the door slammed open. A gust of cold wind rushed through the hallway, and Sarah staggered backward, her eyes wide with fear. From the open doorway came a figure, a silhouette, standing in the darkness beyond. Its shape was distorted, its form shifting unnaturally as if it were not fully off this world. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. Sarah felt the pull of it, felt it beckoning her toward the unknown, but Sarah wasn't ready. Not yet. She had to find a way out. She had to wait. Sudden silence that followed was deafening. The whispers returned, but they were no longer just in her mind. They were real, filling the hallway, crawling along the walls, scratching at her ears, pressing in on her. They were getting closer. You can't leave. You belong to us. We've been waiting for you. Sarah turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold stone floor. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the doors blurring as she ran past them. Whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could hear them right behind her, feel the cold breath of something chasing her. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The house had already claimed her once. She wouldn't let it do it again, and as she wouldn't let it do it again, reached the end of the hallway, she saw another door, this one larger, more imposing. It was her only chance. She had to make it through. But as her hand touched the door, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, a sudden pressure that squeezed air from her lungs. She gasped, stumbling back as a cold, unseen force gripped her heart. "It's too late, Sarah," the voice whispered in her ear, the breath cold against her skin. "You can never escape." And just like that, the door slammed shut. The pain in Sarah's chest intensified, squeezing the air from her lungs like an iron vice. She staggered, her knees buckling beneath her as the coldness wrapped around her heart. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her, taunting her with their cruel, insidious words. "You're already ours. There's no escape from this place. We've always been here. We've always watched." Sarah's breath hitched, her body trembling as she tried to push herself up from the cold stone floor. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't let them win. Every instinct screamed for her to keep fighting, to keep moving, but every step she took felt like an eternity. The darkness that had surrounded her earlier now felt more alive, more tangible. The walls seemed to close in around her, the hallway narrowing with each breath she took. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, each thud a reminder that she was running out of time, running out of options. She could still hear the whispers, louder, more insistent, echoing in every corner, filling her mind with their distorted promises. With a sudden burst of desperation, Sarah pushed herself to her feet. She had no choice but to keep going. The house, the dark presence that lived within it, was trying to consume her, but she wouldn't let it. She couldn't. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of escape. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that had slammed shut in, her face was still there, its frame looming like a dark shadow. She had to get through it. There was no other way. With her heart pounding, she ran toward the door, each step echoing through the silence. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices that seemed to crawl under her skin. But Sarah didn't stop. She had to keep moving. She was close now, just as she reached for the door handle. A hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. The coldness of the touch seared through her, and she gasped, her body jerking back. "You belong to us," the voice hissed in her ear, the cold breath sending shivers down her spine. Sarah struggled, fighting against the grip that held her in a reductant place. She had no idea what was behind the door, but she knew she had to get through it. With every ounce of strength she had left, she twisted her body, pulling her wrist free from the unseen hand. The pressure around her chest eased just slightly, as if the house were momentarily loosening its grip on her. She reached for the door again, her fingers trembling as they grasped the cold metal handle. The moment she turned it, the door creaked open, revealing the unknown beyond. The light on the other side was blinding, sharp and bright, cutting through the suffocating darkness that had consumed her. Sarah stepped forward, her body shaking with exhaustion, but she knew she had no choice but to walk through. The instant she crossed the threshold, the house seemed to collapse around her. The floor beneath her feet buckled, the walls caving in like paper, but she kept moving forward. The light was pulling her, and she couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. Whispers faded into the distance, but the presence remained. She could feel it, its cold fingers brushing against her mind, trying to pull her back. The darkness was still there, but the light ahead was brighter now, guiding her through the chaos. Finally, Sarah reached the end of the path, her heart still racing. She stepped into the light, feeling its warmth envelop her, pushing back the cold. The house, the darkness, was gone. She was free, or so she thought. As Sarah looked around, she realized that the world she had stepped into wasn't quite the same as the one she had left behind. It was unfamiliar, strange, almost dreamlike. The light around her was harsh, artificial, and the air felt stale, like she had stepped into a place that existed outside of time. She turned around, but the door she had come through had vanished. There was nothing but an endless stretch of emptiness before her. The only sound was her own breathing, quick and shallow, filling the silence. "You can never truly leave," the voice whispered once more, filling her ears, her mind. Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow, just the oppressive silence of the world she had entered. She took a step forward, and as she did, the ground beneath her cracked. A deep guttural rumble filled the air, shaking the very fabric of reality. The light around her flickered, dimming as though it were losing its strength. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. She hadn't escaped. She had only crossed into another part of the darkness. The whispers grew louder, closer, and the shadows began to shift. She was trapped again, but this time, she didn't know where the path would lead. "You can never escape," the voice said again, its presence all around her, suffocating her. Sarah took a deep breath. She had fought this far, she had survived this long, and she would fight again. She would never stop, because in the end, there was no escape. Not from this place, not from the darkness, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live within it. The world around Sarah began to warp again. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as if it were alive, shifting with an energy that defied logic. The oppressive darkness that had once haunted her began to reassemble itself, piece by piece, swallowing the fading light. The room she found herself in was no longer the one she had stepped into. It was darker, more twisted, an endless void where nothing felt real. The whispers came again, louder now, more persistent. "You thought you escaped. You thought you could leave this place." The voice was no longer distant. It was inside her mind, crawling through her thoughts like a virus, infecting her sense of reality. Sarah's heart raced. She was suffocating. The walls of this new world, if it could even be called a world, seemed to close in on her, pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. The cold was unbearable, creeping through her skin and sinking deep into her bones. She shivered uncontrollably, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a flicker in the distance, a faint glow that cut through the darkness. It was the same light, the one she had seen before, the one that had pulled her out of the house. But now, it was different. It was weaker, flickering erratically, as if it were about to go out. Without thinking, Sarah started to move toward it. Her legs felt like lead, and every step was harder than the last. But she couldn't stop. She had to reach it. She had to reach it. She had to hold on to that glimmer of hope, no matter how faint it seemed. As she approached the light, it began to grow dimmer, and the whispers grew louder. "It's too late for you, Sarah. This is where you belong now." The voice was everywhere, in the air, in her mind. It was the voice of the house, of the darkness. It was alive, and it was not going to let her go. Her feet stumbled over the uneven ground, but she forced herself forward, inching closer to the light. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of old earth, of something forgotten and left to rot for centuries. The light was flickering like a dying candle, and Sarah knew that if she didn't reach it soon, it would be gone forever. She stretched out her hand, and just as her fingers brushed against the light, the darkness surged against the light. The darkness surged forward, grabbing her, pulling her back into the depths. A scream built in her chest, but no sound came out. The house, the place, the darkness itself had claimed her once again. But this time was different. In the moment, the darkness, that this time was different, enveloped her. Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't escape. But it was something else. Something she couldn't quite grasp. It was as if the house had become a part of her, had seeped into her very soul, changing her very soul, changing her. It was no longer something she could fight against. It had become her reality. The light dimmed, its flicker growing weaker, until it disappeared completely. The house, or whatever this place was, swallowed her whole, and with it, her whole, and with it, her past, her memories, and the very essence of who she had been. But in that final moment, as Sarah's consciousness seemed to slip away, she realized something. She wasn't the one trapped anymore. The darkness had been her cage, but now it was her home. And as Sarah's form melded into the shadows, the last thing she heard was a whisper, "Welcome home." The moment Sarah's body faded into the darkness, the house seemed to inhale, as though it had finally consumed what it had been waiting for. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, as if they were settling, claiming their new prisoner. But Sarah's consciousness remained, like a whisper on the edge of the abyss, still aware, still tethered to the world she had once known. The house had changed her. It had pulled her into its web, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had become a part of the house, just as the whispers had told her. Her presence was now woven into the very fabric of the place. Her presence was now woven into the very fabric of the place. Her essence absorbed by the walls, the floors, the very air, and in the heart of the house, deep within the void where Sarah had been consumed. Something stirred. The air became thick with tension, the silence oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, a shape began to form slowly, like a shadow materializing from the emptiness. The figure appeared. It was a reflection of Sarah, but it was different, twisted. The face was hers, but it was different, twisted. The face was hers, distorted, as if the very soul of the house had reshaped her into something new. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, her features now hollow, yet her gaze was intensely focused, as if waiting. The figure moved with an unnatural grace. Its waiting, step silent as it glided through the airless space. As it moved, the darkness shifted, almost in response to its presence, as though it too recognized this new version of Sarah. The house had changed her, but she had also changed the house. She was now the house, and the house was her. Her hand reached out, but there was no longer any need to touch anything. As she moved, the shadows seemed to part for her, and the walls, once closing in on her, now shifted to make space. The vase floor beneath her feet, which had once felt cold and suffocating, now hummed with a faint energy, as though it were alive, breathing. "Welcome home," the whisper echoed again, not just in her mind, but in the very air around her. It was no longer the voice of the house alone. It was hers too. She could feel it, the bond between her and the house, the intertwining of their existence. She had become something far more than she had ever been before. The once oppressive atmosphere now felt familiar, even comforting in its strange, twisted way. The house, with all its dark corners, its twisted corridors, was no longer something to fear. It was a part of her, and she was a part of her, and she was a part of it. The walls that had once seemed so sinister, suffocating, now felt like arms that cradled her, holding her in a gentle, eerie embrace. As Sarah walked deeper into the heart of the house, the space around her grew more elaborate. The long hallways were replaced by grand, ornate rooms, decorated with ancient furniture and walls covered in dark tapestries. The light that flickered in the distance grew stronger, brighter, and she moved toward it, almost drawn to it. But this light was not the same as the one she had once chased. This light was darker, a pale, ghostly glow that seemed to come from deep within the house. It was the light of the house itself, of the darkness that had been waiting for her. She stepped into the room where the light was strongest. The air felt thick here, heavier than ever, as if the very atmosphere was charged with energy. And in the center of the room, a figure stood, bathed in the dim, eerie light. It was her again. The figure was her reflection, yet it wasn't. The face was familiar but altered, like the darkness had shaped it into something new, something more powerful. The eyes glowed brighter, and the smile that crept across her face was twisted, unnatural. "Welcome," the figure whispered. It's whispered, unnatural voice, not a whisper at all, but a command. It was a voice Sarah recognized, her own, but somehow deeper, more commanding. For the first time, she wasn't trapped anymore. She had become the house. She was the dark now, just as much as the house had once been, and the house had been waiting for her, for them, to unite, to become one. The figure stepped forward, its face now just inches from Sarah's. "You're not alone anymore," it said, its voice soothing in it and terrifying all at once. "We are one now," and Sarah understood. She was no longer Sarah, the woman who had fled from the house in terror. She was something new. She was something new. She was the house. She was the shadows, the whispers, the very fear itself. And together, the house and she would wait for the next soul to wander too close, for the next person to fall into its grip. The darkness had claimed her, and she had claimed it back. The whispers of the house were no longer just voices. They were her voice. The house would never be empty again, and Sarah, or what she had become, would wait patiently, forever, for the next soul to come seeking refuge, to come searching for something they didn't understand, because, in the end, no one ever truly escapes the house, as Sarah, or what she had become, stood there in the heart of the house. The weight of her transformation pressed down on her. Her mind, her very essence, had fused with the dark spirit of the house. There was no longer a line between Sarah and the building. They were one. The walls, the floors, the shadows, they all responded to her now. They were her servants, her extensions, her domain, twisted reflection of her own self. Smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was a predatory grin, full of knowing, full of hunger. This was her now, the being that would forever remain within the boundaries of this cursed place. The house groaned around her, the walls shifting as if acknowledging her power, as if the house itself had just come alive. The ground beneath her feet hummed, a subtle vibration running through it. It was as though the house was breathing, moving, and Sarah was its heartbeat. She turned her attention to the darkened corners of the room. She could feel them, could feel the old forgotten memories that had lingered there for so long, the souls that had once entered this house. Each one had left a piece of themselves behind. Some had wandered into its embrace, never to return. Others had been swallowed by the darkness, never knowing what they had become. And now, Sarah would join them. She was the keeper of this place, its guardian. She was the keeper of this place, its guardian, and its prisoner, the whispers continued. But now they were different. Now they were hers, too. They were hers, and she could hear the faintest traces of something new, a hunger, a longing. "You'll bring more," a voice whispered from the dead tribe, and yet bring for the holes. More souls will wander in, and when they do, you'll be ready. The house had always been hungry, always thirsty for the souls of the lost, and now Sarah, no longer bound by the human constraints of fear or guilt, was the one who would bring them in. She would guide them to the house, just as she had been guided. She would make them see the same twisted truth, that there was no escape. But as the house settled into a familiar, unsettling silence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The power that flowed through her, the power that had once felt so intoxicating, was now tinged with something else, a nagging, hollow emptiness that seemed to stretch forever in the back of her mind. It was then that she understood. The house wasn't just alive, it was aware, and it had always been aware. It wasn't the house that needed her. It was Sarah that needed her. It was Sarah that needed the house. The hunger that had once driven her to find freedom had now become her only desire. She had freed herself from one prison, only to become the prison itself. And so, as time stretched on in the eerie, suffocating silence of the house, Sarah remained there, a part of it. The house's dark presence pulsing through her veins, the whispers never leaving her side. She would wait for the next soul, the next victim, to wander too close, to enter the cursed walls that had now become her existence. The darkness would never let her go. And now, neither would be she.